I'm Alina Wang.
And I'm Ben Hedges.
This week we will be heading to the high snowy mountains of Tibet,
finding out about the history of this country,
its spirituality,
and its connection with China.
Although Tibet is currently incorporated into the People's Republic of China, most Tibetans believe in autonomy or full independence.
And throughout history, even though Tibet was not always part of the Chinese Empire, it was closely linked with China. Margaret Trey now takes us through the history of Tibet.
Nestled between China and India lies Tibet, the roof of the world. Located on a plateau, it is separated from Nepal and India by the Himalayas and from China by the Kunlun Mountains. Executive Director of the New York-based Tibet House, Gendon Thurman, speaks about Tibet's unique situation.
Tibet had always been, under the protection of or in partnership with some other larger power. So they didn't have the need for a big police force. They usually had some other people's laws imposed on them. They didn't have the need for a big, strong central government because, again, there was another government around. So they just carried on with their administration through their religious institutions. And that worked well enough.
According to historical texts, the first documented close interaction between China and Tibet occurred in 640 AD. This was when a Tibetan king Songsan Gampo married Princess Wencheng, niece of the Chinese Tang Dynasty Emperor Taizong. The marriage helped to bridge the two cultures and strengthen the bond between the two countries. Tibet became more intricately linked with China during the Yuan dynasty from 1271 to 1368, when the Mongol Empire conquered Tibet and later China.
Being conquered took away their old system of kings and nobility and this sort of thing. It changed their social order very dramatically, of course, as all conquests, all invasions do. The Mongols, for whatever reason, decided that Tibetan Buddhism would be their state religion. So the Tibetans essentially became the Vatican of the Mongol Empire.
The Mongols made lasting changes in the history of Tibet.
The additional adjustment made by the Mongols was essentially putting the religious people in charge of this territory. So they put the religious people in charge of the Tibetan area within the Mongol Empire. And for various reasons, the Tibetans kept up with that system more or less in the intervening time.
Tibet became known as one of the 13 provinces of the Mongolian-ruled China, and Tibetans gained a huge influence at the imperial court. When the Yuan dynasty collapsed, Tibet reasserted its independence. During this time, the title Dalai Lama was conferred on Tibetan spiritual leaders. Then China under the Ming dynasty centralized governance over Tibet, yet the region still enjoyed a large degree of autonomy. Later, China's Qing dynasty imposed a more rigid set of rules and regulations over Tibet. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1913, Tibet experienced a short period of independence, until 1950, when the Chinese Communist forces invaded the region. For over 6 decades, the Tibetan people suffered under the brutal policies of the Chinese Communist regime. Today, Tibetans in Tibet and overseas are campaigning for a free Tibet.
And Tibetans only want basic rights, basic human rights, religious freedom, and this is what Tibetans are grieving about. And they also want to be Tibetan in their own homeland. They want to celebrate our rituals, our culture, and our language. But China is not allowing this to happen.
Religion plays a huge role in the life of the Tibetan people, and for many centuries, Tibetan's highest spiritual leader has been given the title of Dalai Lama.
We now bring you the story behind the leader of Tibetan Buddhism. He's one of the most well-known spiritual leaders of the 20th and 21st centuries. The present Dalai Lama is the 14th in a long line stretching back to the 1300s. The word Dalai means an ocean, implying an ocean of wisdom. Lama means teacher. Tibetans believe the Dalai Lamas are reincarnations of Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara. When the current Dalai Lama approaches old age, the search starts for the next reincarnation. Starting with the 5th Dalai Lama in the 1600s, they have led Tibet politically as well as spiritually. The 5th Dalai Lama built the Potala Palace, one of the most recognizable landmarks in Tibet. But the current Dalai Lama was forced to flee Tibet in 1959 and is currently living in exile in Dharamsala in northern India. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, is best known for his representation of Tibetans in their struggle for freedom and human rights. In 1989, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his, quote, consistent resistance to the use of violence in his people's struggle to regain their liberty. In 2011, the Dalai Lama retired from politics, breaking the 370-year tradition of the Dalai Lama being the political and spiritual leader of the Tibetan people. According to the tradition of reincarnation, the present Dalai Lama selects his successor. But when he selected a new Panchen Lama in 1995, Chinese authorities abducted the child, who was never seen again. The Chinese regime then appointed another Panchen Lama instead. Thus, it remains unclear as to who will be the next Dalai Lama, the one Tibetans will recognize as their highest spiritual and political leader.
Now, in New York last week, an exhibit of Tibetan artifacts went on display at Tibet House. Ben, you want to take a look, right?
That's right, Alina. I had the chance to talk with Ganden Thurman, the executive director of Tibet House here in the US, about the exhibit. At Tibet House in New York City, a rare exhibit displays photos and artifacts from a period of Tibetan independence in the first half of the 20th century.
It's in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Tibetan Declaration of Independence from the Manchu Empire, which was collapsing at that time, had just recently collapsed, I think in 1911. And the Tibetans declared their independence, as did the Mongolians and others, from the Manchu Empire in 1913.
Tibet, which had been part of China in the Qing dynasty, tried to establish itself as an independent country.
The 13th Dalai Lama, it was significant, understood things. He understood that they needed a big national flag. They needed to have strong central authority. They needed to have a military carrying that flag to their borders and beyond if the need be, as was sort of standard practice of all the other nations and empires out there.
Banknotes, coins, postage stamps, and travel documents of the era are on display, showing examples of the written Tibetan language.
Their language is a part of the Indo-European language tree. It's in the Turkic language group. Writing was taken from Sanskrit, adapted from Sanskrit. They write in a syllabary using words the way we do. They're not pictograms like the Chinese do.
This photo shows the first British reconnaissance expedition to Mount Everest in 1921, with the famous mountaineer George Mallory sitting on the left. The photos also show Buddhism's great influence in Tibet at the time.
Well, Tibet is noteworthy as a culture that is very heavily invested in religious pursuits, spiritual pursuits. It's estimated that they had something like 20% of the male population actually as living as monks in the monasteries. They had somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 monasteries.
Yet this period of independence did not last long.
Of course, they were only independent, in fact, between 1913 and 1950 when the Chinese army, in this case the People's Liberation Army, invaded Tibet. So the invasion of Tibet was a big looting operation. They had to loot Tibet in order to pay for their communist revolution in China.
After the Chinese communist invasion, many Tibetan monasteries were destroyed. Numerous treasures and religious artifacts were stolen or lost. Today, the Tibetan people are so suppressed that they can even be imprisoned for simply waving the Tibetan flag. Yet Thurman believes Tibetan culture will flourish again in a future free China.
They're extremely resilient. They're extremely sure of who they are. They know what their identity is. The purpose of this show is just to remind people of the facts of history.
The Independent Tibet exhibition will run until March 7th at Tibet House in Manhattan, New York. Since the Chinese communist regime took control of Tibet, Tibetans have tried to regain their independence. The most notable attempt was the 1959 uprising.
On March 10, 1959, a revolt started in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. Tibetans had feared an abduction attempt on their spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, by Chinese authorities. So thousands of Tibetans surrounded the Potala Palace to prevent the Dalai Lama from leaving or being taken away.
This then turned into a full-on conflict between Tibetans and the Chinese Communist forces, forcing the Dalai Lama to flee Tibet to India. There he set up the Tibetan government in exile.
More pro-independence rallies took place in the late 80s, the largest of these in 1989, on the 30th anniversary of the 1959 uprising. Chinese security forces declared martial law and expelled all foreign journalists from the region.
Then in 2008, another set of protests erupted in the capital Lhasa and other Tibetan regions during the annual observance of the 1959 uprising. It started with monks taking to the streets to rally for religious freedom, but it culminated in violence, with burning, rioting, looting, and killing.
Chinese state-run media claimed the Dalai Lama orchestrated the protests.
Since 2009, many Tibetans have resorted to self-immolation in protest against the Chinese Communist authorities. Last week, on February 13th, a Tibetan man in the Nepali capital of Kathmandu became the 100th Tibetan to set himself on fire in protest against the Chinese regime since 2009.
That same day in New York, Tibetan protesters chained themselves to the entrance of the Chinese permanent mission to the United Nations to raise awareness about the Tibetan cause.
This is something that Tibetans inside Tibet are demanding for: freedom, independence. Just today we have heard, there's been 100 self-immolations. You know, today we heard news of self-immolation in Ngaba. And again, these people have all sacrificed their lives for freedom, return of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and for independence.
Tibet is currently not a suitable place for any human being. And especially if you're a Tibetan under Chinese persecution, it is very difficult. They don't have any human rights, or you just name it, or like religious freedom or freedoms, whatever, the sort of the liberty which you have in civilized country, we don't have that at all. On the top of that, you have to live under constant pressure from the Chinese government. And this is not a new phenomenon. It has started a long time ago.
The Free Tibet cause has attracted many major Western public figures, including Hollywood actor Richard Gere.
So the sense of self-sacrifice that you have here in these three gentlemen, but we've seen Tibetans everywhere.
Actress Joanna Lumley and Britain's Prince Charles, who boycotted the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics over the human rights situation in Tibet and other parts of China.
Well, that is all for this week. We will be back next Friday.
But until then, don't forget you can also catch all our episodes on YouTube and the latest China news on our website, NTD.TV.
See you soon.